Hi there, welcome back to the podcast, guys, and thanks for tuning in. The guest on this podcast is Lesley Roberts, who, if you watch my videos frequently, you'll have seen me do a couple or three on Lesley's issues just now as a NHS whistleblower who has been declined access to the COVID inquiry after being invited to go on as a witness and jump through hoops with her statements, etc. And I've now got Lesley with us live on a Zoom call, but Lesley's camera will be off for the duration of that. I'll let Lesley explain why going forward, and we'll discuss some of the background to Lesley. She'll have done another podcast with Silver Fox today, which will be talking about the ongoing COVID inquiry issues. But what I'm keen to discuss with Lesley is the other things behind that and how we got to this point. So that's what I'll cover on this podcast, and that'll let people between the two podcasts get a good picture of what's actually going on. So how are you today, Lesley?
I'm okay, thank you. As well as can be expected given the events of the last week, shall we say?
Yeah, it's been a bit busy, hasn't it? Been a bit hectic.
It's not been nice.
Obviously, you know, I was going to come down and visit you, and meet you somewhere and do a video face to face, but that was obviously, there wasn't really much point in that because we weren't able to put your face on camera. Why are you uncomfortable with that, Lesley?
I had always been a union rep, and I had been dealing with a case that was absolutely horrific. A man called Stephen McLaughlin, who has done a number of videos now with Silver Fox regarding getting suspended on what was falsified documents. Now, as part of that case, it links in to contaminated ground, which he's not went into yet. So I will not hugely go into that. But when I was questioning the hospital ground that had been sold off for £1, which was severely contaminated, I found my car on fire at my house. So I was absolutely, words don't even really explain how badly that made me feel. My car was set on fire in August of 2002 at my front door, summer's night, a light night, and yet they set my car on fire. So the police then put me on something called a storm order, which was a kind of, not a protection order as such, but it is the minute I phone if I require police assistance, they have a specific time frame to get to me as part of this storm order. Now, normally a storm order only lasts for a specific period. However, I am still on that storm order almost 2 years later. Now, since my car was set on fire, my locking wheel nuts have been cut off my car, and it really kind of reached an all-time low for me when I was literally told that I really had to start checking the brakes every morning to make sure that the brake pipes hadn't been cut. And at that point, I thought enough is enough. So I relocated. I am now in a location that I do not openly give to anyone. I'm in a village location, and the house is now behind a wall, and it's relatively, I would hope, secure. It's got cameras everywhere, and I'm still on this. Oh, excuse me, on this police protection. Well, this police storm order, as it's called. So a lot of things have happened between then and now, but that is the gist of the story. There's other bits like windows and stuff getting damaged and everything else, and people in my back garden going through outside storage, going through my paperwork. It was a very rough time, given that was the same time, round about that time that my mother was dying as well. So it was a nasty time.
Can you just clarify, how far back did you say this goes?
August 2022, sorry, my car was first set on fire.
So you've been living with this for the best part of 2 years now?
I have been living with public sector ineptness, arrogance, and corruption for a very long time, given the fact that I was a nurse, a registered nurse within NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde. It was a horrific employer. Whistleblowing for all these organisations, paperwork about whistleblowing and how you should speak out, it is an absolute ruse. Nobody is allowed to speak out. There's consequences. They'll warn you there's consequences about filling out any of the internal mechanisms to report anything, speaking out in any way at all. You are treated as the enemy the minute you raise anything that they don't want you to raise. So you had an employer that turned into a monster during COVID as well.
So your first, excuse me, your first whistleblowing activity was you acting on behalf of a union member, and you were the union rep, and that's led to all this chaos.
Yes and no is the answer to that. I had a number of cases prior to that that I've had 3 members who've attempted to take their lives.
Wow.
And it hasn't, as a rep watching that, it hasn't been easy. Cases that would turn even a man with a baldy head into a man with grey hair overnight when you actually see some of the cases that I was dealing with. Stephen McLaughlin's case was horrific. I have never saw anyone still off 6 years later and the organisation trampling all over someone's life the way they have that man.
Wow. So I don't know if you can discuss this or not, Lesley, but I feel I need to ask. Going from being a union rep, dealing with that complaint on behalf of someone else, to getting these incredible things like, your car tampered with and setting fire and police are, telling you to watch your brake pipes and stuff like that. What connects these two things? Who do you think, or what do you think is behind these attempts to sabotage you?
I wouldn't be at liberty to say online what I really think, but it is quite ironic that I raised things with SEPA, who, as you know, deal with the contaminated water, not long before my car was set on fire. Now, incidentally, and just adding to this, I have just been paid out by NHS GGC, and this hasn't reached the papers yet because they only paid me out the other day. I have been paid out because I have asbestos in my right lung, and that comes down to working on that contaminated site, Ravenscraig Hospital. So if you actually look back at some of the articles that have been in the papers, it's been about maybe 130, which were written by the local paper regarding the entire story about that site.
But can I just ask something? You said Ravenscraig Hospital. Is that not a relatively modern hospital?
Oh, no, no. It was an 18th century old building which had been a poorhouse and an asylum.
Right,
Now,
okay, sorry.
it had been used as an industrial dump all those years, hundreds of years ago. And when I could be sitting here talking to you about this for hours,
Yeah.
and you would be, oh my goodness, there is so much involved in the story. I would suggest that you read some of the articles because it is quite it's quite hair raising, quite frankly, to know that the land was contaminated, seriously contaminated. I think it was something like 300% more than what was safe levels, I think it was called. Now, you had Andrew Waterston, Professor Andrew Waterston, who was saying that the land was not fit for purpose. and yet knowing the dangers within that land, they kept us on that land until 2017 and were adamant that no one would speak out. No one was allowed to speak out. There'd be consequences. There'd be consequences. That's all you ever hear within the NHS. There will be consequences to speaking out. Do not fill out the reporting mechanisms which would allow. But we were working on a site where you put on taps, brown ran through the taps. There was asbestos everywhere, hence why I now have asbestos in my right lung. And they've paid me out, so they can't deny that there wasn't. And even fecal fluid came back through the floors, and yet they kept us on that site. Wow. And I have photographic evidence to support that.
That's quite disturbing, to be honest with you, Lesley. And for those who are not aware, SEPA, that's the Scottish overseer for environmental disposal and waste, etc., isn't it?
It's more your water people, SEPA. And I went to any lengths to try and get them to look at various things, and they wouldn't. And I then had to go for subject access requests and look at all the emails that we're sending each other. It's the usual. It's public sector ineptness, corruption, and all basically. Then it happened again. That's twice in one night. Public sector ineptness, arrogance. We're not accountable to anybody, and you will find that when you then go to the governing bodies, depending on what public sector it is, they then allow the public sector to police themselves again. There is no accountability in Scotland whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. Now, I just realised why I was getting mixed up there. Ravenscraig is a place down near Inverclyde. It's no Ravenscraig as in out in Lanarkshire, Motherwell. That's Monklands Hospital. I was thinking, I don't know what happened to my head there. I was getting a bit of brain fog. Right, so you've took us on, introduced to this in your position as a union rep at the time, and it's just led to absolute bedlam. But it's not the only sort of strange things that's happened to you in terms of NHS, etc. The other thing was, are you okay to talk about your mother, Lesley? Are you comfortable with that?
Yes. Okay. She would be comfortable for me to do so.
Right, and your mother was unfortunately in hospital, and I'll give you as much as I know about this. You can correct me if I'm wrong and add to it, please. Your mother was in hospital. She was unfortunately, she didn't come out of hospital. You were what's the name I'm looking for? You had the rights. What's the word I'm looking for, Lesley?
No, you're looking for power of attorney, and no, that's not. No, that's where the problem really began, was that my mother had put a power of attorney in place. That wasn't me. And I did not know that she had done so. The power of attorney was actually my mother's son. So there's a lot of background information on what happened. Him and I did not have a relationship. We have an even worse relationship now. I never want to see him again. There is a lot of background information in that and what happened with my mother, which I've covered with David. But she went into hospital in May 2020 prior to COVID, she had just been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, which had been my concern for quite a long time before she was diagnosed. Now, you get into COVID, you see a woman who is vulnerable, has Alzheimer's, and yet they cut her carers. And I kept writing to the GP, I'm very concerned that my mother is going to have an accident. She's living in the family home. There's no carers going in. There's all these different issues. And the GP couldn't speak to me because the power of attorney wouldn't let him for reasons unknown. Well, reasons I know, but however. And I was correct. She did get into hospital in May 2020, unknown to him and I. She was diagnosed as DNA CPR on the day she actually went into hospital.
And just for people who aren't medically aware, that's a do not resuscitate order, basically.
Yes. And the only reason I found that out is when they put her out in an unsafe discharge plan on the 5th of June. I found that in her dirty laundry bag, all crushed up.
Right, this was something that obviously I had this story in my head, and I had a couple of bits of it slightly wrong. So your mum hadn't passed away at this point, and
No.
she was being transferred. You got her laundry. Now, is that not, you're a nurse, right? Is that a normal thing that would happen, that a scrunched up bit of paper where do not resuscitate would be found by a patient's family?
Nothing surprises me in the NHS anymore.
When I first heard of this situation, my first assumption was, first guess was, did somebody do that knowing you would find it? Was you think that was somebody in there that wasn't too happy with what was going on and was just trying to feed you a wee hint?
As the equalities rep, I was the equality and diversity rep, and I was extremely concerned that by the amount of people that should have fell into the term protected characteristics under the Equality Act October 2010 were getting deemed to be do not resuscitate. And I was basically shouting about that you can't do that. It doesn't meet the terms of the Act. That's not what the Act says. I took that, the trajectory that I took to try and get that dealt with was quite a journey. And I was speaking to MSPs. I had a meeting with 2 senior MSPs who know full well it happened, and then a year down the line they said it was a great revelation. Well, I'm glad it was a great revelation. It should have been a revelation when it was brought to you at the time, but they chose not to take it any further, so I will not name them on here. And I took it to my manager. Why are we doing this? Why is GPs walking onto the ward and deeming all our patients DNA CPR who fit into the role of protected characteristics? I then took it to the Scottish Public Service Ombudsman, who said that there was a blanket approach in relation to all those who were vulnerable. I then put in for subject access requests, and I got that, and I basically turned that over to the police under Art and Part of the Criminal Procedure Scotland Act 1995, because anyone who knew that there was mass DNA CPRs being put on people without their family's knowledge were complicit in it. You should have dealt with it. If a manager is saying to you, families have not to know, the first question you need to be asking is, there is a legal duty of care towards that patient. However, there is a duty of candour to the patient's relatives. And the duty of candour, in my opinion, as the board's equalities rep, is to tell them exactly what's going on with their families. And it's not about cover-ups, everything else. But during COVID, it was all about cover-ups and what can we cover up and what can we do and what can get away with. It was an absolute disgrace.
So these are obviously, are these protocols as such, Lesley, and official instructions that the health boards were having to work to?
Not to my knowledge. And I was not aware of any protocol changing. Now, when I did my training, I was a psychiatric nurse, but when I did my training, we done a stint in the general ward as well, so that we were well, we were equipped to deal with general and psychiatric. So if there was anything within the psychiatric ward that, excuse me, please, that needed dealt with, we had the general training as such to deal with it. Now, you would sometimes see it in the elderly wards. They've got a DNA CPR on them, a do not resuscitate because of X, Y, reasons. And I would understand that. But I will never understand why the relatives were not to know. I will never understand that. And I
Yeah,
will never understand why all these organisations seem to deem it to be okay and acceptable, because in my opinion, in my moral compass, it wasn't acceptable.
Yeah. So what we've got here is we've got two problems. We've got, you would suggest, an unusually high number of the do not resuscitates as opposed to normal times, plus the fact that patients and families were not getting notified.
No, they weren't. And I obviously was looking at that from me, the nurse, with my code of conduct under the Nursing and Midwifery Council. Now, I contacted my own governing body, which is the NMC, and I said to them, look, this is what's happening. And I gave them all the details. And it was like, I was going to all these different governing bodies, the General Medical Council, the Nursing and Midwifery Council, the Scottish Social Services Council, yeah, all of these, the SPSO, and none of them seemed able to challenge anything and were allowing the public sector to govern themselves. It was an incredulous situation.
And it was widespread, Lesley. It wasn't just one hospital or one ward in a hospital. Is this across the board?
Well, I can't speak for across the board, and
Okay.
I'm only speaking as to what I have personally been told. And I was getting calls. Everybody knew who I was. I was quite well known in the kind of nursing environment, really. I had been a nurse a very long time, and a lot of the care home managers, care home staff had worked with me at some point in their careers. So I was getting calls from care homes. This is what's happening. Why are they doing this? Why are they starting our family, our residents on various medications, which then were called the NICE, if you can, it's actually quite laughable. NICE is National Institute for Care Excellence. I mean, have you ever heard anything so ridiculous? NG protocols 163 and 191, and that was the use of 3 drugs, and that was morphine, midazolam, and buscopan, which were getting used specifically on people who were vulnerable.
And this again was just a COVID protocol. This wasn't a normal protocol.
Well, in times gone by, you had the Liverpool the end of life protocol. Now, the Liverpool end of life protocol was used by using 3 particular drugs to end a patient's life calmly. And that was, say for instance, you had a cancer patient who was dying and there was absolutely nothing you could do, and you knew they were dying. And you would speak to the family and you would say, look, these are the drugs that we can give to help that process and the life of your loved one end in a calm and considered way. And I think that was the best for a patient in that circumstances. And it was the best possible ending for the patient, a calm end where that they were not struggling or anything else, a calm end for the relatives, and a calm end for the staff who cared for their patients. But through COVID, they were using buscopan, morphine, and midazolam as part of the COVID process, protocols.
And was this protocol set out to aid death, or was it set out to help fight COVID? What was the logic behind it?
It didn't fight COVID, it suppressed the person's breathing. So
Yeah,
you
so
had, sorry,
was,
Craig.
was this put in place to people who were diagnosed with COVID?
I can only speak to what I was getting told because I never witnessed it being given, but I was getting told it from everywhere. And if you watch the inquiry, we'll not mention that word right enough. If you watch the inquiry, there is a lot of people speaking about this process. And it seems to me that you had patients going in who potentially could have lived. And if you watch the video by Dr. John Campbell, he goes into it in quite, he's very, very good at explaining how patients who had COVID, their breathing was suppressed anyway. However, these drugs suppressed it further. And in his video, it explains how a lot of these people could have lived and yet didn't because of specific processes that were put in place.
Right, and now something else that's attached to your inquiry story statements, right, and the whole thing, the inquiry, is your feeling that there could possibly have been criminal activity, which
Yes.
can be investigated.
Well,
what is that
yes.
theory based on, Lesley?
I would be here all day speaking about that. I decided when all this was going on with the inquiry and they didn't want me court participant status and everything else, I decided I took the decision on the 1st of March that I was going to Cowcaddon's police office with Roger Livermore, the ex-Crown prosecutor, and Rab Wilson, who, like me, had been an NHS whistleblower. And the three of us made a complaint. The three of us made a complaint to Police Scotland regarding corporate manslaughter. And we produced the evidence, which I believe is very real. And we didn't produce it on that day. That day was a bit of a... Roger, Rab and I went up, announced who we were. They didn't really want to hear from us. I then produced a letter that I had written to the Lord Advocate, Dorothy Bain, who had come back to me and saying, if you believe that there has been criminality, you should be reporting it to Police Scotland. So that's exactly what I did.
Yeah.
I approached Police Scotland and I reported what I felt were crimes against humanity. So they gave us a reference number and sent us on our way. And it was after that that I was contacted by the unresolved homicide team, who have been at the house now a number of times, taking evidence from me. And the case, as of last week, has now been all put together. It's all complete and it's all been submitted. And it's a very, very, very vast case.
And what are the allegations, Lesley?
I don't want to get into that fully because what I'm frightened of is that if I release that potentially might damage the criminal case. And what I don't want is I don't want those in charge basically knowing what I believe the crimes have been and trying their best to cover them up, if that makes any sense. I don't want them to know what those allegations are, Craig. But
to summarise,
surrounds a lot. Summary-wise, PPE, risk assessment, RIDDOR recording, hazard definition warning tables, all of the stuff that I've just spoke about the NG protocols, the DNA CPR. Sorry, by not doing
RIDDOR. What is RIDDOR?
RIDDOR, RIDDOR. That is recording if there is any disease or anything. If someone has an accident at work or there is some kind of disease at work, it should be RIDDOR recorded. Well, during COVID, there was next to no RIDDOR recording being done, and that came from the Health and Safety Executive. And that then shredded the link between contact to contract.
Now, again, forgive my ignorance, Lesley, because I've looked and read lots about you, and I've spoke to you, maybe 3 or 4 times over the last week or two. So I've not got everything in the grey matter as yet. But were you a specialist nurse at some time with infectious diseases or something like that? Did I pick that up right?
No, what it was I was a registered nurse. However, I was the ward's infection link control nurse. So I had the internal training to do that, and I also done an external training, an external diploma in infection control. So prior to COVID, it was myself and the ward manager who done all the infection control audits, all the different training, all the different processes that we had to do to meet the criteria for passing our infection control audits.
Yeah. So not taking anything away from the thousands of hardworking nurses out there. I wouldn't describe you as a normal nurse, and I don't mean that in any negative way at all. I love the nurse, I love the NHS and the work that they do. But you were the union rep, so you would have had to have known about law and a lot of legal stuff. You've got infectious disease certification. You
Health and safety.
You're involved in a lot of stuff that normal nurses might not be. So you're not just somebody in a ward that's seen a couple of things and decided to complain. You were a person with knowledge and experience in a number of fields that make your allegations and things, I think, a wee bit more solid. Is that fair to say?
All I would say is, you says infectious diseases. I was infection control, which is kind of two different things. So
Okay.
just to kind of rectify that.
Right.
The thing that really gets me about this is I was a health and safety rep. I had legal standing. And as a health and safety rep, you should be protected under the Employment Rights Act, the Health and Safety at Work Act, the Brown Book, all the COSH different regulations. You should have been absolutely protected by law to speak out about the various things that I was speaking out about. But even when I spoke out about the laundering of uniforms on site, the health board were caught basically breaching GDPR.
One last question on the subject. So with your knowledge, your expertise, you're obviously confident that the list of evidence you've given would be enough to suggest there's good potential for corporate manslaughter have been carried out. Is that where we are?
Yes.
And
the evidence, even the police called it vast evidence.
Okay.
Vast
and
evidence.
And it has been investigated. It's not been finished. So obviously, there's somebody somewhere is digging on this. And who would be the culprits of this corporate homicide?
Jean Freeman, Nicola Sturgeon, and potentially art and part under the Criminal Procedure Scotland Act. Could be a number of others. But the problem then is you don't have all their messages surrounding the decisions that were being made during COVID. You don't have all the gold commands meetings. Now, prior to COVID starting, you had Professor June Andrews standing up in the Scottish Parliament saying that a pandemic would be a useful thing because it would you would get rid of bed blockers. That's a dreadful thing to say. And while she stood there and acknowledged that was a horrendous thing to say, still continued with it. You had Angus Robertson, I think his name is, standing up saying that, elderly deaths would help the war for independence because the elderly tend to vote for different political parties. It just looked to me as if a deadly pandemic, which I believe was very real. A lot of people don't, but I do. I believe it was very real. Where it came from, I don't know, but it was very real. But I believe it was politicised to suit the agenda of the politicians and not to protect the public.
No, I appreciate that. Well, Les, I'm conscious of the constraints on your time. I can't thank you enough for coming on and sharing your story. I can't commend you enough for your bravery, your determination. These things I've all picked up during our conversations over, the last sort of fortnight, 10 days or so that we've been chatting and messaging each other. And thank you for, sharing that with me. If you were to put a figure on it, just as a percentage, how confident are you of getting the result and the aim that you want from all this, which would be a criminal case in a court of law?
The problem you have is you have the Lord Advocate sitting as a government minister under Section 44 and 48 of the Scotland Act 1998. Now, in a normal country, those two roles, head of the judicial system and Scottish Government, or whatever you want to call them, head of the Scottish Government legal team as such, should be separate roles. However, what you've got in Scotland is a Lord Advocate sitting with a dual role. Now, I believe that that is completely absurd. And I have written to the police and said to them that